Mrs. Moreland's consternation about Joe Goodman arose from the fact that she had lived her entire life within the reassuring confines of what was known as Old Savannah. Old Savannah was a sharply circumscribed, self-contained world. The supporting roles for all of its dramas had been cast long ago. In times of crisis, one turned to the relevant figures in the community: the legal authority, the moral pillar, the social arbiter, the financial titan, the elder statesman. Old Savannah was well structured for dealing with crises. Having spent a lifetime in this comforting environment, Mrs. Moreland was surprised that in his moment of need Jim Williams had reached out to someone completely unknown, rather than to Walter Hartridge, for example, or Dick Richardson. It was a signal to her that something was terribly off kilter. With so much talk centering on Jim Williams, his origins, his career, his exploits, his everything, the incident of the Nazi flag came in for a good bit of rehashing, and now a shooting with a German Luger no less. Some people, even a few Jews like Bob Minnis, dismissed the Nazi flag as insignificant. "It was stupid," said Minnis. "Jim acted quickly, without thinking." But others were not so inclined to let Williams off easily. "I'm sure he doesn't actually think of himself as a Nazi," said Joseph Killeran, an English professor at Armstrong State College. "But come on, Nazi symbols are not totally bereft of meaning. They still carry a very clear message, even if they're displayed under the guise of historic relics. The message is superiority, and don't think for a minute Jim Williams isn't aware of it. He's too smart not to be. In the South, among extreme chauvinists, you sometimes find a strange affinity for Nazi regalia. It has to do with the sense of once having been treated for what one was worth, and now being treated merely as an equal. There's a terribly social gentleman here in Savannah who sometimes wears Nazi uniforms to costume parties. Anyone could tell you who I'm talking about. He's known for it, and he says he does it for shock value. But the deeper meaning is still there. In Jim's case, it may not be anything more than apolitical arrogance. If a man lives in the grandest house in town and gives the most extravagant parties, he could easily come to believe he was superior. He might also think the rules for ordinary people no longer applied to him. Displaying a Nazi flag would be one way of demonstrating that. All in all, if a straw poll had been taken in Savannah in the first few weeks after the shooting, it most likely would have shown that the public expected the case to be dropped. By all appearances, the shooting had been self-defense, or, at worst, a spur-of-the-moment crime of passion. Matters like these were traditionally settled quietly, especially when the accused was a highly respected, affluent individual with no criminal record. Savannahans were well aware of past killings in which well-connected suspects were never charged, no matter how obvious their guilt. One of the more colourful stories involved a society spinster who had claimed that her gentleman lover had shot himself with a rifle while sitting in a wing chair in her living room. The woman found her lover's body, cleaned the rifle, put it back in the rifle case, then had the body embalmed. Only after having done all of that would she call the police. "Old Jim Williams will probably get off," said Prentice Crow, a Savannah aristocrat, "but he'll still face a few problems. There's bound to be a certain resentment about his having killed that boy. That boy in particular, I mean. Danny Hansford was a very accomplished hustler from all accounts, very good at his trade, and very much appreciated by both men and women. The trouble is, he hadn't quite finished making the rounds. A fair number of men and women were looking forward to having their turn with him. Of course, now that Jim's shot him, they never will. Naturally, they'll hold this against Jim, That's what I mean when I say resentment. Danny Hansford was known as a good time, but a good time not yet had by all. At the bar in the Oglethorpe Club, Sonny Clark put it more bluntly. You know what they're saying about Jim Williams, don't you? They're saying he shot the best piece of ass in Savannah. The entire city was captivated by the sensational shooting, and for weeks afterwards curious Savannahans drove their cars into Monterey Square and circled around and around. Dog-eared copies of the September-October 1976 issue of Architectural Digest, the one with the feature on Mercer House, were passed from hand to hand. People who had never been inside the house came to know it as if they lived there. They could tell you that Danny Hansford had died midway between an oil painting attributed to the nephew of Thomas Gainsborough and a gold-encrusted desk that had been owned by Emperor Maximilian of Mexico. They could recite, with malicious glee, the now ironic concluding sentence of the article. The charm of the city and its way of life have found expression in William's careful and loving restoration of Mercer House, a house once ravaged by war and neglect, but now housing a centre of harmony and quiet living. There was one major imponderable in the case against Jim Williams. Spencer Lawton, the new district attorney. Lawton was too good at the job to be predictable. Also, he owed a debt of gratitude to Lee Adler, whose support and beneficence had helped put him into office, and whose long-running feud with Jim Williams was well known. Lee Adler was uniquely positioned to influence the course of events if he chose to do so. He could, in private conversation, encourage Lawton to prosecute Williams. Or, as seemed less likely, he could urge lenience. To people who were bold enough to ask if he was pressuring Lawton in any way, Adler stoutly replied, "Spencer Lawton is his own man." For more than a month after the shooting, Lawton kept a remarkably low profile. His name was never mentioned in press coverage of the case. All public statements from his office were made by his chief assistant. A preliminary hearing was set for June 17th, at which time Lawton would decide whether or not to seek an indictment. 5 days before the hearing was due to take place, Lawton went before Chatham County grand jury and presented his evidence in secret session. The grand jury acted quickly. It indicted Williams for first-degree murder, premeditated and with malice aforethought. The severity of the charge raised a few eyebrows. If there was to be an indictment at all, involuntary manslaughter had seemed a more likely charge than murder, given what was known of the case. Lawton would not discuss the events publicly, except to say that the lab tests had been only partially completed. Jim Williams would have to stand trial. A few days after the indictment, Danny Hansford's mother sued Williams for $10,350,000. No, she didn't. A few days after the indictment, Danny Hansford's mother sued Williams for $10,003,500. She charged that he had killed Danny in an execution-style shooting. The $3,500 was for funeral expenses. Even now, Williams maintained an air of unruffled calm. His trial was not scheduled to begin until January, more than 6 months away. He asked the court for permission to go back to Europe on another buying trip, and permission was granted. When he returned, he kept to his old routines. He had his hair cut by Jimmy Taglioli on Abercorn Street. He shopped at Smith's Market. He ate dinner at Elizabeth's on 37th. He was not even slightly remorseful. He had no reason to be, he thought. As he had told the Gazette, "I have done nothing wrong."